This is a video about Misfits Nuclear Wasteland. If you want the short answer, I think it's worth at least one visit, especially if you like Fallout. But if you're interested in hearing me yap while you play Subway Surfers, then just set me in the background. This is all going to be very stream of consciousness. I'm just going to put up some B-roll footage or something, maybe the occasional photo if it's something relevant. So, the first thing I should probably cover is the setting. Misfits takes place in 2296, which is concurrent to the Fallout television show. It also takes place in Utah and has three big factions: the NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, and the Legion. There's also an isolated Vault Dweller faction, a neutral townie faction, a generic tribal faction, the Followers of the Apocalypse, and generic Wastelanders if you don't want to affiliate with anyone or do your own thing. And from my other understanding, they're also working on other tribes. Last I checked from the Discord, they're working on adding the 80s, which is, I think they're mentioned in Fallout New Vegas. That's aside the point. They're an old world blues. That's also aside from the point. Anyhow, this is also probably a good spot to get the lore out of the way. If you've ever scrolled a place like True Fallout STL or watched some YouTube videos, you might be aware of the fact that Fallout lore debates are an unpleasant and painful affair. My first suggestion, which I hope you take to heart, is to just plug it out, but still do your reading when possible. You don't need to know the pattern of underwear Kimball was wearing when he got ventilated by a Frumentari, but you should at least know that the Legion consists of genocidal misogynistic murderers before you decide to join as a Legionnaire. Now, I'm not going to go and preach over the lore here because it's bound to be outdated as the server progresses. The script is outdated, I know that much. But the two sources that you should always have handy are both the official Misfits wiki, which is linked in several places, and the independent Fallout wiki. Now, the Misfits wiki has been updated at a shockingly fast rate, at least from when I last checked, and it tends to have up-to-date information on things such as faction relationships, faction-specific guidelines, and faction-specific lore, or at least the lore that you need specific for the server, making it the go-to source for if you want to know how things work specifically on this server. So, for example, you check the Super Mediums page, and you'll already have a handy relations chart indicating who will immediately murder you, who's just going to ask you to leave, and who's going to call you a charged term. There's also stuff like grooming requirements for NCR soldiers being present, or law lists to reference as needed. Now, if you plan on playing a faction, it never hurts to scroll through their page in advance. The independent Fallout wiki is also mainly useful just for background information, which isn't contained on the Misfits wiki. If you need the wider backstory of a faction, they're bound to have it. Just remember, though, that anything you find on the Misfits wiki or guidebook takes triage over something you might find on the independent wiki. For example, the Legion of Misfits is slightly less misogynistic in letting women hold more combat roles than they'd otherwise be authorized, where in base Fallout lore, they're just misogynists who don't let women fight in any capacity at all. This is probably also a good time to segue into another section, which is gameplay loops. Misfits has 4-hour-long rounds, sometimes longer if they're extended with a majority vote near the 4-hour mark. And in addition, you're also able to, if you're not in windowed mode, see how many hours or minutes you have left in the round. Now, there's also multiple ways to leave the round if you need to do that. You're able to as well respawn as different characters if you happen to die for a round or cryo during a round. It can be seen as sort of a sandbox of sorts. So, just to list off a couple things you could do as a Wastelander. You could run around ruins and loot scrap and then sell it in the bazaar for a profit. You could refurbish an old house and then make it your own or something, maybe make your own furniture. You could organize a street gang and try to bully people into giving you their lunch money. You could make your own little fruit stand, sell your own grown home produce. You could be a mercenary and sell your services to people, or a traveling merchant who sells scrap, or you could be a homeless drug addict who's wallowing in self-pity and begs for money. That's like 7 different options right there. And all of those are sorta viable, give or take. You aren't given a task or objective to win. The game trusts you as a player and expects you, as a player, to have a character with their own goals and motivations. Maybe you just want to drink a lot of booze and vomit out your liver, or something like that. Effectively, the game requests and rewards you for generating ideas, being creative, and subsequently, as a result, creating interesting stories. Even jobs like, say, being a town farmer can have a little bit of wiggle room. You're affiliated with a faction in the town, but that doesn't stop you from doing your own thing or having your own interests. Maybe you want to mass produce cash crops like tobacco and sell hand rolled cigarettes to NCR soldiers when they pass through town. Maybe you're from Idaho and you just really like growing potatoes. You could give yourself a quirk, and that might not be exactly meta, but it'll create roleplay scenarios. Maybe you really like mac and cheese, so you're paying extra for every box you get, or you really like, say, rad roach meat, and you're angling to get that whenever you're at a shop. Outside of these more sandboxy roles, you're also able to have factions. So those will offer you more structured systems and directives and hierarchies. Some people like to call the shots as a leader, or others like leading groups of people. And factions, you could provide yourself that. Their objectives in the region are also ways in which the wider macro plot of the round is able to be progressed, and it creates potential wedges for the story. So, for example, the Brotherhood sees technology as something to be protected, which is a code word for hoarding technology. They see somebody with a Pip-Boy. That's a tier 3 relic that they are mandated to requisition in accordance to their guidelines. So the owner flees into town for protection, and they grant him asylum by refusing the Brotherhood entry. The Brotherhood threatens the town, leading to the NCR to push to support the town, leading to a war between the NCR and the Brotherhood over the town. The Legion, meanwhile, uses the chaos to negotiate an alliance with the tribals before swooping in and taking out a weakened NCR to supplement their control over the region. All of that would have independently and naturally resulted from roleplay interactions between the factions, and overall, at the end of the day, lead to a interesting, memorable, and hopefully fun story being created. Faction leaders, similarly, have a very outsized role in the flow of the sandbox. One leader in the Legion, maybe they're simply interested in pillaging the area to grow the wealth of the Legion and gain local clout. Another leader of the Legion, maybe they're more interested in slowly building up the infrastructure of the organization, so they'll focus more on, like, slave raiding and then forcing those slaves to build forts or something for the Legion. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that the setting, the factions, and the framework create a very fluid round that has the potential to be different each time that you play it. You're always free to fall into the same cycle of go to loot location, kill hostile NPCs, and then sell at shop for 4 hours, but there's also a significant degree of freedom in how you conduct yourself if you don't enjoy that gameplay loop. So you're able to roleplay in as structured or as free of a manner as you would like, which I feel is a great but also very delicate balance to strike in a fork such as this. As for other parts of the fork, it was definitely a bit of a splash of cold water to be put into another fork after being so used to RMC 14 controls personally. Like, crawling is bound to R, for example. That threw me off a lot. Then there's also other stuff that I'm not personally too familiar with, like surgery, which I'm fairly sure is a direct port from other forks like Goob, which I have little to no experience with. The ability to choose your loadout is also appreciated, along with the ability to name items, though that's a fairly minor part of this fork. The map is oh so nice. I imagine it took a long while to port, and the care that went into it is pretty fairly seen. There's lots of locations to loot, there's an entire sewer system, there's unique hidden weapons, there's other points of interest, and also lots of things to shoot at, like NPCs. You'll have the full suite of enemies from rad roaches to deathclaws, with weaker mobs usually being seen in more commonly walked areas, and more hazardous ones like deathclaws typically being positioned out of the way on top of some pricey loot. Admittedly, this sort of forces you to either get good at kiting or running away from hostile wildlife, or you gotta keep yourself strapped with some sort of weapon or some sort of person to protect you, like a guard or mercenary. though you won't have to worry about wildlife if you just never encounter them in the first place by sitting in a single spot for the entire round. I will also say that the map has been getting updates. I know that since I've written this script and recorded some of my footage, it's been expanded somewhat. New things are regularly enough getting added that it still keeps things fresh enough and still gives you new things to loot or look at. As for criticisms, firstly, I am going to confess, the very presence of the Legion in this fork does make me nervous. I'm able to separate the fact that Legion players are very different from the characters they play, and from what I've seen, plenty of them do seem to be really good people, but they're well adjusted and all that, but in my mind, I must confess that I am always very paranoid, a very specific Legion fan creeping through. As the faction itself, in the state they're in, they're sort of perpetually a heel that's very easily isolated from the rest of the world on account of crucifying people, calling other people degenerate profligates, and having the whole backstory from Vegas setting themselves up as genocidal rapists. By the nature of the server being a 17 plus environment, and nobody really wanting to roleplay out or receive the nastier parts, like the rampant misogyny, you end up with a sort of dissonance of sorts, where you know the faction is very evil and has all these bad things, but it doesn't really translate into what you see in game. And I imagine this is an issue that previous Fallout forks have had to tackle. Lord knows that there's been a lot of them in 13, and even in 14, there's been a couple cracks at it. But I'm ultimately assuaged and hopeful that the worst excesses of the Legion and its fans aren't going to creep in. It's also probably gratifying to turn a Legionary into Mist, which isn't as easy when you don't have Legionaries to kill. Another fear I have is the Rangers as a faction. From my experience from other not be names, there was a trend where people would play the NCR, get enough hours, play Ranger, and then only play Ranger. And as a result, there would be a shortage of NCRA players, and the Rangers would sort of turn into the de facto leadership for the NCRA, despite ostensibly being their own branch doing their own thing. And there's been a bit of a split in that, where you have the Rangers piss off and not interact, and then it's hard to coordinate, and they might be provided of a friendly faction to roleplay with. But then you also have the NCR base, then they just turn into a fancier protag job to gloat over other players with. But luckily, the fork seems to have obtained a significant enough population that this isn't as much of an issue as I feel it will be. Because when you have 100 players regularly, 120 players regularly, there's probably going to be enough people to fill in the NCR army, and there's going to be enough people to fill in Ranger slots, especially when they're so limited. And as for the NCRA, I'm sure there's a loyal enough base of NCR army players, and if I last remembered, they are adding a dedicated base for the Rangers, which will keep them away from the NCR base, and hopefully they use that base and don't just micromanage the NCR out of their own base camp. This is a criticism that I'm adding a bit post facto in editing, so that's why I'm sounding different right now. But the art style, another criticism I have for the fork is that the art style is in a bit of a messy state in terms of consistency. You have a mishmash of different sprites from different places in different styles, and as a result, they end up clashing with the environment around them. So, for example, several windows are from the server's upstream. So you'll be in the Fallout fork, and then you look around, and that's a window from a space station. Literally, it's from a fork which is based around space stations. So it looks very different. It looks way too modern for Fallout, I guess, in a way. And same thing goes for stuff like the walls, which you manually build. And it really clashes with the rest of your environment. Then there's other stuff like items, like beakers, that might be less detailed than the sprites that immediately surround them. Try comparing a beaker to like a chemistry set or even the table that you might see the beaker on. The detail is heavily contrasted, where you have a really simple sprite and a really high detail sprite that isn't shaded or anything like that. Or, for example, something like meat sprites, where you have the normal upstream slab of steak, and then you have these textured, like gecko meat sprites, which are considerably different. None of this is supposed to be a jab, though, at contributors or spriters, as I imagine they have a large backlog of things to add. But it is definitely something that could, in my opinion, kind of break somebody's immersion where they are in this, I guess, sort of gritty setting, and then they see this kind of cartoonish looking sprite. The final concern that I have written down is more of a pet peeve, so really take this with a grain of salt, and that is front door roleplay. You might have seen it yourself, but it tends to consist of one faction, maybe it's the Brotherhood, maybe it's the NCR. They'll walk over to the front door of another faction's base, and then they just stand there, maybe throwing insults at each other. Something that just sort of bores me. How does this benefit the faction that they're working for? Why are these characters entering a battle of morality like it's, some sort of crappy Reddit thread? In what way does this develop or display interesting portions of your characters or your faction or their ideologies? At the very least, campfire roleplay lets you infodump character backstory in a cushy and comforting setting. With this, it's just logging onto r/Fallout memes and sorting by controversial. It also applies sort of to both parties. The base owners should probably shoo them off as they're on their territory, and the people who are engaging with them could probably find other, more productive things to do within their faction. Maybe that's looting places, maybe that's going on patrols, or maybe it's clearing out bandits. Whenever it happens, they don't really produce any memorable, just genuine moments, and I just sort of feel myself progressively withering away from the stupidity of the arguments that end up occurring at the front door of these bases. All right, what else? Right, this fork is still in development. Some stuff isn't implemented yet. Last time I checked, cooking recipes were completely borked. Like, all sorts of things weren't functional because it would need upstream ingredients, or things like the guidebook. I remember that being quite depreciated when they swapped off of the guidebook from being in game, and then they swapped over to the wiki being the main source of information, and the material wasn't accessible there. I also personally wish you had to do more to actually survive and live during the round and stimulate the economy. I think I went through an entire 4-hour round without actually needing to eat a single time. I understand that it could be a bit painful, especially without it, but just there's no pressure to really grow food or hunt food, so you just end up with rotting corpses of animals that are ignored or unattended farms, or if you do farm, you end up with a massive surplus of food that'll last you the entire round, maybe even the next round or the round after that if it went on for that long. And then on top of that, the food and vendor system just ends up as more of a novelty or a cosmetic, and areas like bars, kitchens, or canteens, they sort of just end up unused, which I feel is fairly unfortunate. I still fondly remember setting up canteen calls on other forks, or I remember the preparatory meal lines that I see whenever I run rounds on RMC PvE, where you have everybody just relaxing with each other, eating a meal. It's some good, cushy, low stakes roleplay that I think is just really comfy to have in a round. Perks could probably also use a bit of tweaking. It's really easy for somebody to pick up the polyglot perk for effectively free, and then they just know any language. Unless they change that since I've written this script. I'd also need to check, but I'm pretty sure that there's an accessibility version of short-sighted, because, the short-sighted trait that makes you legally blind applies a glassy effect to the screen, even if you're wearing glasses, because it doesn't do anything to fix that. And as a result, if you want to have a short-sighted character, it's kind of genuinely eye-straining. I'm also still waiting for the special system to arrive. Unless that's already happened since I've written this script. This script's old. I should probably say that this script is very old. Also, more crafting recipes. I'm pretty sure they've added more since I've checked in. I'm going to be doing more checking in after I pump this out. I think that's all. Wrapping it up, good fork, still in development, player culture still in a fluid state as the project gets its legs, but I'm optimistic that it could end up as a nice and foster a healthy environment. If you like Space Station and like Fallout, try it. If you never touched Fallout, you should still try it. Anyhow, I'm gonna go on a Deadlock Lose streak now to ruin my day, so thank you for listening, I hope you have a good day, and happy hunting out there.